Today I'll be refuting Richard's claim that the death penalty is an unethical practice of capital punishment. His three secondary claims were that the death penalty costs too much. Number two, it violates human rights. And then number three was his example of Stanley Williams, who was the Crip Gang co-founder. Two out of three of his claims were claims of value and not fact. And he also lacked source evidence for two of his claims. So the first one is that he said that it costs too much. I want to say that the cost is to keep the innocent people alive until they're proven guilty. And he lacked evidence. He threw out some numbers about each cost of death penalty versus life in prison. But I did my own research and found that the cost is not exact or definite because each case is different, a different complexity, and each state has different appeal processes that range from different time lengths. And also the cost increase is due to death penalty opponents, like prolonging the process. And if the appeal process was done in a financially responsible way, that the death penalty is less costly than feeding and housing murderers for life. For example, in Florida, where the death penalty is legally practiced, death penalty cases receive automatic direct review by the Florida Supreme Court, and it's usually completed within 3 years. Number two, the death penalty violates human rights. I want to rebuke and say that the punishment should fit the crime. Criminals such as murderers and terrorists that have committed these crimes have violated the lives of other innocent people and should be punished for the irreversible and unforgivable actions. And my opponent also said that 150 innocent people were exonerated from death row, and this is in the last 45 years. And I would just like to say that, like any system, there are flaws, but with advanced technology and DNA testing and also modernized crime scene science, we are able to eliminate uncertainty of guilt or innocence. And then third, they talked about Stanley Williams, who was the Crip Gang co-founder, who murdered 4 people and was in jail for 26 years. And while he was waiting for his death date, he wrote children's books about gang violence, and the public thought that he had changed and been reformed and didn't believe that he deserved death any longer. And this is a claim of value, not fact, because it's their opinion and that they don't deserve, that he didn't deserve death even though he killed 4 people. Criminals that have committed heinous crimes, including Stanley Williams, I'm not saying that he has, often have mental illnesses that may not be reversed or resolved through rehabilitation. So maybe Stanley Williams did have productivity in his jail life, but in some cases, people with like PTSD, schizophrenia, and personality disorders, rehab is not always the solution. According to the National Institute of Justice, 68% of 400,000 prisoners released in 30 states in 2005 were arrested for new crimes within 3 years, and 77% of them were arrested within 5 years. So, in conclusion, his 3 claims were it costs too much, and it violates human rights, and the case of Stanley Williams. He lacked evidence in support to these claims, and which led me to my own research to find that there is no exact cost, that crimes should be punished. Crimes should be punished, and rehab is not always a solution for these mental ill people, mentally ill people. Thank you.
Gesundheit. Structurally, it's easy to follow. I think you've got a legitimate argument here that some of the claims are value-based and they should be dealt with a little bit differently. The cost argument is the one that is probably the least value-based, and you make a suggestion that said that the costs are mostly a result of the appellate process, which is contributed to by the opponents of the death penalty in the first place. You mentioned that there are ways to perhaps expedite this. You mostly assert that these kinds of things are likely or possible, and I thought that that was a little bit problematic. You have got an example of Florida that you use to illustrate this point, and I like the example of Florida, although a source would be nice to go along with that. And it would be great to know exactly, well, like you said, Florida seems like the appeals go straight to the Florida Supreme Court, so I guess they bypass an appellate court before it gets to the state Supreme Court, which simplifies things and reduces the number of appeals. And the court acts on it in a short amount of time, relatively short amount of time. Like I said, I'm sure that you found that that's true someplace and there's some source for that, but you ought to be citing that source. On the human rights issue, that's clearly a value-based question. You suggest that the punishment should fit the crime, which is a value kind of response to that particular point, but there's no explanation about how the punishments, for example, why the loss of the death penalty would not fit the crime. You kind of just take the assumption that the death penalty does fit the crime. It is appropriate for the crime that's being presented. I think this would be one of those places where you want a couple of examples of the sorts of crimes that people committed and our inability to forgive that, or our desire to express support for the victims or the outrage of society at this by stepping up and saying, this is the kind of act that is necessary to address this issue. When you mentioned the whole issue about innocent people being exonerated, I wasn't sure if that was the advocate's argument. I'm not sure how it hits the issue of the human rights point. Your response to it is that it's actually a small number over 45 years, and that with new technology, we're going to make that less likely to happen. It's going to remove uncertainty. That's all an assertion. I didn't really hear any evidence on that point. That would have been something to provide some evidence for. I think that would have worked. And then on the Stanley Williams case, again, you point out that it's a value claim, which I think you were right on that. The question of whether or not somebody deserves it is, in fact, a value-based issue. Now, your argument seems to be that they claim that because there's rehabilitation, that means that he's less deserving of it. And I guess your argument is that a lot of criminals have mental illnesses. They aren't going to have that kind of rehabilitation, and then you present some evidence that talks about the likelihood that they're going to relapse and commit additional crimes. So therefore, the notion that we should be getting rid of the death penalty because people could potentially reform, it's less likely to occur. I think that's the argument that you're trying to make, but I think that's a little bit hard to piece together from the way it was developed here. Your information is not or irrelevant, I guess is the better way to say it, but the relevance needs to be explained a little bit more clearly. And just as a kind of vocal evaluation, be careful because your voice sometimes drops out while you're speaking. You have a lot of people.
I just got my wisdom.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. But yeah, that might be part of it. A lot of people have this issue that when they get from one point to another, they're trying to make a transition, and which is good because you want maybe a little pause or silence as you're moving from one point to another. The problem is that you want it to be a pause, not you drift out and then you drift into another point. That sounds a little awkward, and your tooth issue may have been a part of that. Sorry that you had to come in and deal with that, but that's the way of the world sometimes.